June 26, 1945. San Francisco. Representatives from 50 nations gather in the San Francisco Opera House for a historic moment. They're about to sign the Charter of the United Nations, a document promising to save humanity from the scourge of war. Just weeks earlier, Nazi Germany had surrendered. The war in the Pacific rages on. Europe lies in ruins. 50 million people are dead. In this moment of unprecedented destruction, world leaders are attempting something never successfully done before, creating an international organization powerful enough to prevent future world wars while respecting national sovereignty. This is the story of how the United Nations was born from the ashes of World War II, how wartime alliance became permanent institution, how idealism confronted realpolitik, and how humanity's greatest attempt at collective security took shape in a world still at war. The idea of preventing war through international cooperation wasn't new. For centuries, philosophers had dreamed of perpetual peace. Immanuel Kant wrote about it in 1795. The Hague Conferences of 1899 and 1907 attempted to codify laws of war and establish arbitration mechanisms. But these were limited agreements among sovereign states, with no enforcement power. World War I, which killed 16 million people and shocked the world with its industrial-scale slaughter, created momentum for something more ambitious. American President Woodrow Wilson emerged as the prophet of a new international order. His 14 points, announced in January 1918, called for open diplomacy, free trade, self-determination, and most importantly, a general association of nations to guarantee peace and security. Wilson's vision materialized as the League of Nations, established by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. The League's covenant committed members to collective security. An attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. Member states would impose economic sanctions on aggressors and, if necessary, contribute military forces. An international organization would mediate disputes, oversee disarmament, and prevent war through cooperation and collective action. It was a revolutionary concept. For the first time, sovereign nations formally subordinated their freedom of action to collective decision-making. They accepted that international peace was everyone's responsibility, not just a concern for the directly threatened. But the League was doomed from birth. The U.S. Senate, despite Wilson's presidency, refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, keeping America out of the organization Wilson had championed. Without the world's emerging economic powerhouse, the League lacked credibility and resources. The Treaty of Versailles itself, which punished Germany harshly while ignoring Wilson's principles, poisoned post-war international relations. The League's structure had fundamental flaws. Unanimous decisions meant any member could veto action. The League had no standing military force and depended on members voluntarily contributing troops, which they rarely did. Economic sanctions required unanimous support and could be undermined by non-members. The League could recommend but not compel. Initially, the League had successes. It settled territorial disputes, repatriated prisoners of war, combated epidemics, and addressed labor conditions through the International Labor Organization. It helped stabilize new states created from collapsed empires. For a brief period in the 1920s, the League seemed to be working. But the 1930s exposed its impotence. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. The League condemned Japan but took no meaningful action. Japan simply withdrew from the League and kept Manchuria. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. The League imposed sanctions but excluded oil, the one commodity that might have stopped Italy. Ethiopia fell and Italy withdrew from the League. In 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. The League expelled the USSR, which was meaningless since the USSR hadn't been participating anyway. Most fatally, the League failed to prevent German rearmament or expansion. When Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, annexed Austria in 1938, and dismembered Czechoslovakia in 1938–39, the League was powerless. Britain and France, the League's most powerful members, pursued appeasement instead of collective security. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, triggering World War II, the League of Nations was already irrelevant. The League's failure taught crucial lessons that would shape the United Nations. Unanimous decision-making was unworkable. Economic sanctions alone couldn't stop determined aggressors. An international organization needed major powers' participation and commitment. It needed enforcement mechanisms stronger than mere moral authority. And it needed to address not just security, but also economic and social conditions that bred conflict. As World War II raged, leaders began planning a better post-war order. The name United Nations was coined by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, reportedly during a conversation with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in late December 1941, just weeks after Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt, ill in bed, suddenly thought of the phrase from Byron's poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Here, where the sword United Nations drew. Churchill, in his bathroom at the time, called it an excellent name. The term United Nations first appeared publicly in the Declaration by United Nations on January 1, 1942. 26 nations at war with the Axis powers pledged to continue fighting together and not make separate peace. This wartime alliance was the UN Seed, a coalition of necessity that leaders hoped to transform into a permanent organization. Roosevelt was the UN's principal architect. Unlike Wilson, who had been an idealistic professor, Roosevelt was a pragmatic politician who understood power. He believed America couldn't retreat into isolationism after this war, as it had after World War I. American security required international engagement. But Roosevelt also knew the Senate would never accept an organization that significantly limited American sovereignty or required automatic military commitments. Churchill was more skeptical. He believed in the British Empire and great power dominance, not universal collective security. But Britain was financially dependent on America and couldn't afford to alienate Roosevelt. Stalin, focused on Soviet security and expansion, had little ideological commitment to international organization, but saw advantages in codifying Soviet great power status. The first step was the Moscow Declaration of October 1943, where foreign ministers of the US, Britain, Soviet Union, and China recognized the necessity of establishing at the earliest practicable date a general international organization based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all peace-loving states and open to membership by all such states, large and small, for the maintenance of international peace and security. Note the qualifications: peace-loving states, which excluded Axis powers and could be interpreted to exclude anyone the victors disliked. Sovereign equality, which sounded democratic but would be contradicted by the veto power given to great powers. These tensions between idealism and power politics would define the UN from the start. The crucial planning occurred at Dumbarton Oaks, a Washington, D.C. estate, from August to October 1944. American, British, Soviet, and Chinese representatives drafted the UN's basic structure. They agreed on a General Assembly where all members would have equal representation and voting rights, and a Security Council where great powers would have permanent seats and special responsibilities for maintaining peace. The Security Council was the heart of the system. It would have the power to investigate disputes, impose sanctions, and authorize military force. Unlike the League, Security Council decisions would be binding on all members. But the great powers insisted on veto rights. Any permanent member could block Security Council action. This veto was essential for American and Soviet participation, but contradicted the principle of sovereign equality and ensured the Security Council would be paralyzed by great power disagreement. At Dumbarton Oaks, the Soviets initially demanded 16 votes in the General Assembly, one for the USSR and one for each Soviet republic. This was absurd but reflected Stalin's paranoia about being outvoted by Western-aligned nations. Eventually, a compromise gave the USSR 3 votes for the USSR, Ukraine, and Belarus, which still made little sense but allowed negotiations to proceed. Another crucial issue was regional security arrangements. Latin American countries, led by Argentina and Mexico, wanted to preserve the inter-American system. The British wanted to maintain the Commonwealth. The Soviets wanted freedom to dominate Eastern Europe. The solution was Article 51 of the Charter, which recognized the right of collective self-defense, allowing regional alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact to exist alongside the UN. The Dumbarton-Oaks proposals were refined at Yalta in February 1945. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in the Crimean resort to discuss post-war Europe and finalize UN details. They agreed that unanimous Great Power Agreement would be required for substantive Security Council decisions, but not for procedural matters. They also agreed on trusteeships for former colonial territories, though this system would be weak and colonialism would largely continue until decolonization movements forced the issue. Roosevelt came away from Yalta believing he had secured Stalin's cooperation in building a peaceful post-war order. He died in April 1945, just weeks before the San Francisco Conference that would establish the UN. His successor, Harry Truman, was less trusting of Stalin but committed to Roosevelt's vision. The San Francisco Conference opened on April 25, 1945, just 2 weeks after Roosevelt's death and 2 weeks before Germany's surrender. Representatives from 50 nations gathered, all those that had declared war on the Axis by March 1, 1945. Notably absent were the defeated Axis powers and nations that had remained neutral like Switzerland, Ireland, and Sweden. The conference lasted 2 months and was contentious. Smaller nations, led by Australia's Herbert Evatt, fought to limit the veto power and strengthen the General Assembly. They largely failed. The great powers insisted on their prerogatives. Latin American nations successfully expanded the Charter's language on regional arrangements and human rights. Colonial powers resisted strong language on self-determination. The Soviet delegation, led by Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, was difficult. Stalin was already consolidating control over Eastern Europe, and tensions with the West were rising. The Soviets objected to including Argentina, which had belatedly declared war on the Axis but had been sympathetic to fascism. They demanded that Soviet-occupied Poland be included as a founding member. These disputes previewed the Cold War tensions that would soon paralyze the UN. China's representation was another issue. The Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, was included as a great power and permanent Security Council member. But the Chinese Civil War was paused during World War II and would resume afterward, eventually bringing Mao Zedong's communists to power in 1949. For decades, both communist and nationalist governments would claim to represent China at the UN. Civil society played an important role at San Francisco. Non-governmental organizations, though not official delegates, lobbied for human rights provisions, trusteeship oversight, and stronger international law. The Charter's preamble reflects this influence. We the peoples of the United Nations, rather than we the governments. This language suggested the UN represented humanity, not just states, though in practice, governments controlled everything. The Charter's preamble is eloquent, expressing aspirations that reality often contradicted. To save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. The Charter established 6 principal organs: The General Assembly, where all members had one vote, could discuss any matter within the Charter's scope and make recommendations but had no binding enforcement power. The Security Council had 11 members, later expanded to 15. 5 permanent members US, USSR, Britain, France, China, with veto power, and 6, later 10, non-permanent members elected for 2-year terms. The Security Council had primary responsibility for maintaining peace and security. The Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, would address economic, social, cultural, educational, health, and human rights issues. The Trusteeship Council would oversee territories transitioning to independence. The International Court of Justice, based in The Hague, would adjudicate legal disputes between states, and the Secretariat, headed by a Secretary-General, would be the UN's administrative arm. The Secretary-General's position was delicate. The office needed to be powerful enough to act independently, but not so powerful as to threaten state sovereignty. The first Secretary-General, Norway's Trygve Lie, described himself as the most impossible job in the world. He had to balance great power interests, maintain neutrality while advocating for UN principles, and manage a growing bureaucracy. On June 26, 1945, delegates signed the Charter in alphabetical order by country name. China signed first, as alphabetically first in the conference's official language, English. The signing ceremony was broadcast by radio worldwide. President Truman, attending the conference, addressed the delegates. "You have created a great instrument for peace and security and human progress in the world. The world must now use it." But using it would prove difficult. The Charter was full of compromises and contradictions. It affirmed sovereign equality while granting veto power to 5 nations. It proclaimed universal human rights while protecting colonialism. It created binding Security Council authority while allowing any permanent member to paralyze the Council. It called for disarmament while expecting members to maintain forces for UN operations. The Charter required ratification by the 5 permanent Security Council members, plus a majority of other signatories. By October 24, 1945, now celebrated as United Nations Day, ratifications had been deposited, and the UN officially existed. Unlike the League of Nations, the U.S. Senate ratified the Charter overwhelmingly, 89-2, having learned from World War I's aftermath that isolationism was unsustainable. The first General Assembly session convened in London in January 1946. 51 nations attended, the original 50 signatories plus Poland, which had been added despite Soviet-Western tensions over its government. London hosted the first sessions because Europe remained devastated and no permanent home had been established. Selecting a permanent headquarters was contentious. Geneva, the League's home, was considered but seemed tainted by failure. Philadelphia was proposed. San Francisco wanted the honor. New York business leader Nelson Rockefeller campaigned for a New York location. Eventually, John D. Rockefeller Jr. donated $8.5 million to purchase land along Manhattan's East River. The site was technically international territory, not part of the U.S., though obviously in New York. Construction began in 1948, and the headquarters opened in 1952. The first substantive issue the UN confronted was Iran. In early 1946, Soviet troops remained in northern Iran despite wartime agreements to withdraw. Iran complained to the Security Council, the first dispute brought before it. Under pressure, including American threats, the Soviets withdrew. This seemed a success for the UN, but it also revealed how the organization reflected power realities rather than transcending them. The UN's early years were defined by Cold War. The Soviet Union used its veto repeatedly. By 1955, the USSR had cast 75 vetoes while the US had cast none. This wasn't because the US was more cooperative, but because the Western-aligned majority in the General Assembly usually supported American positions, making vetoes unnecessary. The Security Council, meant to be the UN's executive arm, was frequently paralyzed. The Soviet absence from a Security Council session in June 1950, protesting the UN's recognition of nationalist China rather than communist China, allowed passage of resolutions condemning North Korea's invasion of South Korea and authorizing UN military action. Technically, this was collective security in action, but in reality, it was American military action with UN authorization. The Soviets never made that mistake again, ensuring they were always present to veto. Despite Cold War constraints, the UN achieved important early successes. It mediated the 1948-49 India-Pakistan conflict over Kashmir, establishing a ceasefire and observer mission that continues today. It oversaw Indonesian independence from the Netherlands. It established universal human rights standards through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948. Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's widow and U.S. delegate, chaired the Commission on Human Rights that drafted the Universal Declaration. It was a revolutionary document, proclaiming that all humans, regardless of race, religion, nationality, or status, possessed inherent rights including life, liberty, security, equality before law, freedom from torture, freedom of thought and religion, and economic and social rights. The Declaration was aspirational, not legally binding, but it established standards against which governments could be judged and inspired human rights movements worldwide. The UN also addressed Palestine. Britain, exhausted by mandate responsibilities and unable to reconcile Jewish and Arab claims, dumped the problem on the UN in 1947. The UN proposed partition into Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international control. Jewish leaders accepted, Arab leaders rejected it. Britain withdrew in May 1948, Israel declared independence, neighboring Arab states invaded, and war resulted. The UN couldn't prevent the war but did mediate armistices and established the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, to assist Palestinian refugees, a temporary measure that continues 75 years later. Decolonization became a major UN focus as African and Asian colonies gained independence. The General Assembly became a forum for anti-colonial movements. The Trusteeship Council oversaw peaceful transitions. The Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, 1960, stated that all peoples have the right to self-determination. Colonial powers resisted but couldn't stop decolonization's momentum. By the 1960s, dozens of new nations joined, fundamentally changing the UN's composition and priorities. The UN's specialized agencies addressed issues beyond war and peace. The World Health Organization, WHO, established in 1948, coordinated disease eradication efforts, most notably smallpox, declared eradicated in 1980. The Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, combated hunger. The UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, promoted education and cultural preservation. UNICEF protected children. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank, though not technically UN organs, worked alongside it on economic issues. Peacekeeping emerged as an innovative UN function, though it's not mentioned in the Charter. The first peacekeeping mission was the UN Emergency Force, UNEF, deployed to the Sinai in 1956 after the Suez Crisis. Blue helmets, lightly armed troops from neutral countries, deployed with consent of conflicting parties, would become iconic. Peacekeeping wasn't enforcement, it was monitoring ceasefires and providing buffer zones. At its best, peacekeeping prevented conflict resumption. At its worst, as in Rwanda 1994 or Srebrenica 1995, inadequate forces and mandates watched helplessly as massacres occurred. The UN also became a stage for Cold War theater. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev famously banged his shoe on the desk during a 1960 General Assembly session. In 1960, the Assembly session saw Khrushchev, Nasser, Castro, Tito, Nehru, and other leaders attend personally, creating unprecedented diplomatic intensity. General Assembly debates allowed small nations to criticize superpowers publicly, though with little practical impact. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 showed both the UN's potential and limits. U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson dramatically confronted Soviet Ambassador Valerian Zorin with photographs proving Soviet missiles in Cuba. The Security Council provided a forum for public diplomacy, but the crisis was resolved through direct Kennedy-Khrushchev negotiations. The UN was a stage, not a decision-maker. The 1960s and 70s saw the UN increasingly focus on development and decolonization. The UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, and other bodies addressed economic inequality between developed and developing nations. The new international economic order movement demanded reforms favoring developing countries. Developed nations largely resisted, and global economic inequality remained vast. The UN's reputation suffered from several failures. The Congo Crisis, 1960-64, saw UN peacekeepers caught between Cold War proxies and unable to prevent chaos and Patrice Lumumba's assassination. The UN failed to prevent or stop genocides in Cambodia, 1975-79, Rwanda, 1994, and Srebrenica, 1995. Critics argued the UN talked while people died, hamstrung by bureaucracy, veto power, and member states' lack of will. Yet the UN also had successes. It brokered peace agreements in Namibia, Cambodia, Mozambique, and El Salvador. It verified nuclear disarmament agreements. It coordinated humanitarian responses to disasters. It provided a forum where even the smallest nation could address global issues. The World Food Program fed millions. UNHCR protected refugees. The end of the Cold War in 1991 briefly raised hopes for a new world order, where the UN could fulfill its original vision. Without superpower rivalry paralyzing the Security Council, collective security seemed possible. The 1991 Gulf War, where the UN authorized a US-led coalition to expel Iraq from Kuwait, appeared to vindicate the collective security concept. But the 1990s also brought challenges. Ethnic conflicts in Yugoslavia demonstrated that preventing internal conflicts was more complex than deterring interstate aggression. Humanitarian intervention, using force to stop atrocities within sovereign states, raised difficult questions about sovereignty versus human rights. The UN's slow response to Rwanda's genocide, where 800,000 died in 100 days, was shameful. The UN faced growing criticism. Conservatives, especially in America, saw it as bloated, ineffective, and anti-Western. Progressives criticized its failure to prevent atrocities and its deference to powerful states. Accusations of corruption, particularly in the Oil-for-Food program with Iraq, damaged credibility. Peacekeepers in some missions were accused of sexual abuse, tarnishing the Blue Helmets' reputation. The 2003 Iraq War deeply divided the UN. The US and Britain sought Security Council authorization for invading Iraq. France, Russia, and China opposed, threatening vetoes. The US invaded anyway with a coalition of the willing, bypassing the UN. This raised fundamental questions. Was the UN relevant if the world's most powerful nation ignored it? Or did America's decision to seek UN authorization first demonstrate the organization's moral authority? The UN adapted and reformed, though never enough to satisfy critics. Peacekeeping doctrines evolved to emphasize protecting civilians. The Responsibility to Protect, Doctrine 2005, asserted that sovereignty entailed responsibility to protect populations from mass atrocities, and that the international community should intervene if states failed. This was controversial. Critics saw it as justifying Western intervention. Supporters saw it as necessary to prevent genocides. The UN expanded its membership as more nations gained independence. By 2011, it had 193 members, nearly every recognized country. Notable exceptions included Vatican City, which has observer status, and Taiwan, excluded after the UN recognized the People's Republic of China in 1971. Kosovo and Palestine gained observer status despite not being universally recognized as independent states. The Security Council's composition became increasingly anachronistic. Why should Britain and France have permanent seats but not Germany or Japan, both major economic powers? Why no permanent African or Latin American representation? Reform proposals have circulated for decades, but face the impossible hurdle that any charter amendment requires approval by all 5 permanent members, none of whom will voluntarily surrender their veto. Climate change emerged as a major UN focus. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, established in 1988, assesses climate science. UN conferences produced the Kyoto Protocol 1997 and Paris Agreement 2015, attempting to coordinate global emission reductions. These efforts have been partially successful but insufficient to prevent dangerous warming, hampered by national interests and weak enforcement mechanisms. The UN's Sustainable Development Goals, adopted in 2015, set ambitious targets for 2030, ending poverty and hunger, ensuring health and education, achieving gender equality, combating climate change, and more. These goals provided a framework for development efforts, but whether they're achievable remains uncertain. The COVID-19 pandemic tested the UN, who coordinated global health response, though it faced criticism for allegedly deferring to China initially. COVAX, a UN-backed initiative, attempted to distribute vaccines equitably but struggled as wealthy nations prioritized their own populations. The pandemic revealed how national interests still trumped global cooperation, even for threats requiring collective action. Today, the UN faces criticism from all sides. It's accused of being simultaneously too powerful and too weak, too dominated by the West and too anti-Western, too bureaucratic and too ineffective. These contradictory criticisms partly reflect the organization's impossible mandate: be a forum for all nations while acting decisively, respect sovereignty while preventing atrocities, represent all nations equally while acknowledging power realities. What has the UN achieved in its nearly 80 years? It hasn't prevented all wars. That was always unrealistic. The veto power ensures it cannot act when great powers disagree. But it's helped end numerous conflicts, provided humanitarian assistance to hundreds of millions, established human rights standards, coordinated responses to global challenges, and offered a forum where even the weakest nations have a voice. Perhaps most importantly, the UN has normalized the idea that international problems require international cooperation. Global health, climate change, terrorism, migration, these issues transcend borders and need collective responses. The UN provides infrastructure for that cooperation, even when cooperation is imperfect. The founders who gathered in San Francisco in 1945 weren't naive idealists. They had just witnessed history's deadliest war. They understood power politics, national interests, and human imperfection. They didn't expect the UN to create utopia, just to make another world war less likely and to mitigate international anarchy. By that modest standard, the UN has succeeded. There's been no World War III. Nuclear weapons haven't been used in war since 1945. Major powers compete through proxy conflicts, economic pressure, and diplomatic maneuvering rather than direct warfare. Interstate wars have declined, though civil wars remain common. Critics are right that the UN is flawed. The veto power is undemocratic. The Security Council is unrepresentative. Bureaucracy is unwieldy. Effectiveness varies enormously. But what's the alternative? A world without any forum for international cooperation, without peacekeepers to monitor ceasefires, without agencies combating disease and hunger, without standards for human rights. The UN isn't world government. It was never intended to be. It's a tool states use when cooperation serves their interests and ignore when it doesn't. It reflects the world as it is, not as we wish it were. As Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld said, the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. From the rubble of World War II, the UN was built on hope that reason and cooperation could overcome conflict and chaos. That hope was tempered by realism about power and national interest. Nearly 80 years later, the organization endures, imperfect, frequently frustrating, occasionally inspiring, and absolutely necessary. The work begun in San Francisco in 1945 continues, unfinished but essential, as humanity struggles to build a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world.